constant, and these are the flute and piccolo scales for the Ontario Provincial Honor Band. Alright, so we're going to start with a C chromatic 3 octave. Sometimes for these ones, I find the trickiest fingerings are getting up into that 3rd octave from sort of the G sharp, A sharp, B, and then the C. So the bar in particular, that 5th bar of the excerpt, is one to look at with particular detail. The choice between that 3 octave C chromatic or the 2 octave A flat chromatic, also slurred. So we'll do the A flat chromatic as well. Now for both of these chromatic scales, some of the fingering switches that might be particularly tricky are going to be sort of from that A flat, G, G flat, F, E natural, that sort of range. So to get those really, really even, I would definitely recommend working on that with a metronome, going that over quite slowly and then speeding it up. We also have 2 major scales, and then there are 2 octave arpeggios as well, B flat major and D flat major. So we'll start with B flat major. It is the friendlier key, but for this one it's really important to give a lot of support for those lower notes, and keep sort of grounded with a nice open throat for those higher notes so that it doesn't sound too thin at the top. So we'll start with B flat. And then a D flat major. For this one here, I find the trickiest part is always just making sure that you remember all of those G flats, and also just that lower section with all of that pinky work from the D flat to the E flat, getting over there really quickly. So that's definitely one thing to work on for this one. Alright, and if you're interested in playing piccolo, there are scales for piccolo as well. Now for those ones, because we don't have the C or the D flat on the piccolo, that's just the A flat chromatic and then the B flat major scale and arpeggio. So I'm just going to warm up a little bit. Alright, so for that A flat chromatic, it's really important to just, it gets quite high up there, so just keeping that support and also that transition from the sort of lower, sort of more earthy tones of the piccolo to sort of above that E, F, G, up into the higher, more clear tones. So I'll start with the A flat chromatic. And then for the B flat major scale and the arpeggio, the same thing as with the flute, making sure that those lower register notes are nice and full, and then trying to keep that fullness as you go up through the top notes. And especially with that arpeggio, those high notes are going to speak so clearly on the piccolo anyway, and you need a lot of force to get them out anyway. So it's important to really focus on those low notes so that it's not sort of a disproportionate, you're playing quietly in the low end, and then as you get higher you sort of shriek and play really loudly. So we'll do the B flat major scale and arpeggio. the scales for flute and piccolo auditions for Ontario Provincial Honor Band. Hi, my name is Sarah Constant, and this is the flute audition for the Ontario Provincial Honor Band, Etude Set B. Alright, so let's first look at Etude number 1. This one, is lento. It's a little more on the lyrical side. It's also in F minor, so it has that nice sort of dark quality to it, that dark sort of earthy quality. So one thing that I sort of really like to work on with something like this first is getting a nice sort of dark and intense kind of lower register sound, and especially because it starts and ends in the low register, that's a really, really good thing to have for a study like this. And then, also it does start and end quite low, but it does reach quite high as well. So one thing to consider with this is working through, both your lower and higher registers so that your lower register doesn't sound too diffuse and that it's a nice focused dark sound. And also, similarly, that the higher register doesn't sound too thin and that it has some of that fullness from the lower notes as well. Other things that I would kind of take a look at in a study like this, first of all, if you're not super comfortable playing in this key, making sure that you get all of those D flats when they are D flats, and also looking at some of the syncopations. So for example, there's a little bit of it in bar 7, and definitely bar 9 is one that I would totally work on with a metronome, really work towards subdividing, because you want to make sure that all 3 of those quarter notes don't arrive too late or too early, but they're right halfway through that beat. So with that in mind, I'll just play through the first couple lines, then we'll work through the end as well. So there's the first part. As you're transitioning into that third line, like I said before, definitely, take a metronome to bar 9. And then also as you get up into those higher notes, the F, G, A flat, just making sure that you have that same easiness and evenness of fingers that you had in the lower register. Sometimes there's a tendency to sort of clamp onto the flute because it's high and it's scary, but it's really important to just sort of relax your fingers, and it's not that much different than the stuff you were playing before. And of course, working with those dynamics, they pretty much follow the shape of the phrase, so it's not too difficult to start a little bit on the quieter side, when it's high up there, playing with a nice full strong tone, and then tapering down again as you reach the end of the piece. So I'll play from sort of pick up to bar 9 to the end. Two parts that you might want to draw your attention to. First of all, in bar 10, I find if you need to sneak an emergency breath after that F, so that you get a nice full A flat, that works just fine as long as you can still connect the phrase. And then also bar 13 to 14, getting that octave. So, a lot of what that is when you're playing that G and that F, the lower F, already start thinking about the sound that you want and sort of imagining the sound you want on that high F, so that once you play it, it's already there. So, bar 13. to Etude number 2. This one is definitely a little more on the technical side, and of course the line to watch out for is the third line, bars 5 and 6. That's where I'd say the most technical passage is. This entire study, I think, is a really good place to use your thumb B flat key if you're not using that already, just because it avoids a lot of the, some of the cross fingerings that tend to crop up in these types of keys. One thing that I would really recommend doing while you're working on bars 5 and 6, that third line, is sort of playing through it slowly a couple different ways. Whenever I see sort of these large register jumps like this, I always kind of first look at the top line and sort of play through it, focusing on that. And if the lower notes don't really speak the way I want them to, who cares? And then I'll play through it again, slowly as well, and then just focus on getting a nice, clear lower note. So for example, these B flats. And if the higher notes crack or they don't speak, doesn't matter. And then eventually I'll work on putting it together so that I have a nice sort of strong foundation on my lower notes, and then also, nice clarity on the upper notes. So, starting off with something like this. All right, so working on the higher ones and then on the lower ones. So, as you see, I'm not even really thinking about, the other set, but just working on getting them, one at a time, the lower ones and the higher ones sort of nice and clear, and then you can begin to put it together. And so on and so forth. One thing to keep in mind with this kind of key is for those middle register E flats and Ds, making sure that you keep this finger up. Sometimes if you're coming from a different octave, or if you're descending from an F or whichever, the tendency is to kind of let it get lazy and keep it down. But then what you're doing is you're actually playing a harmonic from the lower octave, so it's gonna not be the best tone it can be. Whereas, it'll sound so much clearer if you just keep this finger up. So a good example of that is in bar 5 with that this figure. What's the difference between this and this? Alright, so with all that in mind, and also, looking at all those 2-note slurs, I'll just play the first little bit of this from the top. And so on. One thing to really look at here is these really stark dynamic contrasts from mezzo forte to piano or forte to piano, and what that is really just sort of an echo. And the way to do that is making sure that right until that sort of subito piano, you're still playing loud, because if you let it taper off into a piano, the effect is not going to be quite as dramatic. So for example, going from bar 2 to bar 3, instead of, you can't really tell where the echo begins or where the first phrase ends. Instead, you want so that it's just a very sudden contrast. This study actually, I think, works really well for piccolo as well, if you're interested in auditioning on piccolo. I find that, the technicality of it really transfers well to the smaller mechanism. So I'll play a little bit of it on piccolo as well. It's the same sort of things you need to work on, getting that fluency from the top and lower notes in that third line. And also working through your fingering so that they're even and that you have all of those two note slurs. And so on. So especially with piccolo, because it's so tiny, it is important to sort of work through all of those different large intervals as you're doing those widening intervals. Just to make sure that you are getting a good tone on both of the notes and that you're still carrying through the line of the music. Because all it really sort of is an embellished scale. All right, so moving on to Etude number 3. This one, I think, this one has a lot of trills, and the important thing to keep in mind when you're playing these trills is sort of quality over quantity. I think it's often so much more effective to, maybe only change notes a couple times, but have a nice musical forward-moving trill than to, fit as many notes in as possible, and then it loses some of its tone quality, or you lose your sense of direction. And I think that's the main thing to keep in mind. It's also really helpful with something like this to play it through a couple times without doing any of the ornamentation at all, because then you really get a feel for what the line is. So for example, looking at from bar 32, it looks kind of crazy at first with all of the dynamics and the trills and the articulations, but if you just play through it, it's essentially just a descending sequence. And with that skeleton in mind, then you can start to add things to it. And so on. So with that in mind, I'll just go through the study from the top. So that's about it for this one. I'm just working through, making sure all those trills are even and they feel easy so that they sound easy. And, always keeping in mind that, amidst all of those different ornamentations, there is a melody there, and that's what you really want to try to bring out. So thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, definitely feel free to contact your music teacher, and good luck on your audition.
And we don't care about the young